The bullet ricocheted, making impact with her flesh with a soft sound. Shit! Her ears thrummed with the sounds of her heartbeat as she felt the cold thrill of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Turn, Miles. Turn, turn, turn. Fuck! Why isn't he turning? Lillian focused her attention on Miles, her eyes devouring information and churning out details. Her mind needed only a moment to evaluate the scene in front of her. Miles' vest shredded, and his left hand bloody and mangled. Shreds of skin barely holding to the bone. His right hand gripped the steering wheel as his head fell downward, causing their CL Imperial Phaeton to shift sharply towards the shoulder. Lillian only had time to yell, "Hold on!" before they drove off the shoulder, and the vehicle dove towards the earth far below. A 1929 Studebaker Commander pulled over and two men, one large and one small, exited the car. Their eyes were rapt on the smoking wreckage at the bottom of the wash. "What do you think, Sonny?" "I think we ought to make sure they're dead." "Fine, you do it. I'll be in the car." Jimmy turned back to the Studebaker. Sonny hesitated before shrugging. I'm sure it's all right." He followed Jimmy into the car and closed the door. He sat there for a moment before lighting up a cigarette. The two men kept watch. "That sun is burning a hole through me. Sonny, can we go?" Jimmy complained, his whiny voice at odds with his large frame. "I know, but hold steady. We need to make sure no one crawls out. This place is a shithole." Jimmy complained, eyeing the lightly tanned hills. "Agreed on that, big guy. But do you want to be the one to tell the boss that we don't know for certain they bit the dust?" Jimmy shook his big dumb head slowly. Sweat dripped down his pronounced forehead. "Nah, Sonny. I don't want to tell the boss that, but they're dead. No one could survive that fall." They watched in companionable silence as the crushed cannon of a car smoked at the bottom of the hill. He hesitated before starting the engine, and then spun the car around towards the east. "They're dead. Let's go." Jimmy was too busy watching the hills, intent on finding a mountain bluebird or a bighorn sheep before they crossed back into Idaho. His swift, intent eyes caught a glimpse of an antelope and a lone jackrabbit, but he failed to see the signs of life within the wreckage. Soon their taillights were pointed towards Nevada, away from the destruction which they had caused and the retribution which they had wrought. Lily to her friends crawled from beneath the wreckage of the car. She ignored the cuts and scrapes accrued through the crawl. Shards of glass, dirt, and metal seeming to stick to every piece of skin. Miles' pride and joy? The sky blue CL Imperial Phaeton, now a black, bent, broken wreck. Smoke and a sizzling sound belched out from under the hood. Lily wiped at the fresh blood on her forehead. She sighed and bent to pull Miles from the car. He moaned, but did not waken. That's a bad sign. Lily crawled back into the car to make sure Jen was alive. Bleeding and talking incoherently, she was alive and awake. A bonus. Lily pulled, pushed, and cajoled Jen out of the car. She strove to persuade Jen to help her drag Miles' limp body, but instead Jen slumped in shock on the bare earth. Lily noted a small trail of black ants crawling over her friend, surely biting, but Jen Shake's Malayo gave no indication that she felt any pain. Lily bit her lip and pulled alone. "God, you're a heavy SOB, Miles." She stumbled and fell as she pulled Miles from the wreckage. Once completed, she fell to her rump on a rock near Shake's. She tried to convince her to get up and move into the shade, but either Shake's ignored her, or the girl was still in shock. "Well, Miles," she spluttered while wiping mud, sweat, and tears from her cheeks, "it's gonna get cold around here." The rabbit brush and sandy hills were familiar to her. The reason why she had urged Miles to drive at such reckless speeds. "We're close to Reno," she had told him. "We'll be safe there." She had lied. Except we weren't. And we didn't even make it that far. My mom's dad used to live out this way when I was a girl, so I know how the temperatures plummet after dark. I'll have to get us to shelter soon." She trailed off. "Wait right here." She tried to lock gazes with Shakes, but the other girl wouldn't meet her eyes. "Just don't go anywhere. I'll be back in a jiff." Hopefully. Lily bent down, lacing up her burgundy alligator hand-stitched shoes. They were made for a man, but these shoes were her pride and joy. They had cost her a whopping $5. The first dollars that she had earned working for Frank Nitti. Frank had worked for the man himself, the big boss, the fat cat, Al Capone. She began walking. The direction she picked at random, or rather on the vaguest notion of a memory. "I think that there was an old mining camp around here somewhere," she mused aloud. "Grandpa used to point it out every time we passed it." She climbed the nearest, lowest hill, and saw the telltale sign of glinting off a metal roof. Careful to watch her footing, and to not take the light from her sight, she traveled towards it. When she was within a few feet, she saw a weathered, mud-splattered old sign. She pulled out her old handkerchief and to wipe the grime off the sign. It read 7 troughs, 3 miles. She sighed heavily before turning back around to corral her partners. To her credit, she only briefly thought of leaving them to their own fate. Once back at the car, she took stock of their situation. Lily was wounded but could walk. The wounds to her head and hands had stopped bleeding, but no doubt they would need further tending to once they made it to shelter. Shakes was shell-shocked and Miles was still out cold. Great. A light breeze stirred and threatened to gather in strength. This made their trek on the dirt road they followed a challenge. The road climbed and grew steeper as it led her deeper into the nestled hills. In daylight, it would have been a captivating view. As it was, the shadows lent the air a creepier disposition than she cared for, especially for a city girl. Somehow, they made it the 3 miles to 7 troughs by following a lone, blinking light. Lillian Jameson, ... The hills called her name, her full name. They whispered it, but she knew that there was no one there. She tried to hurry their pace but was obstructed by the walking dead demeanor of her dearest friend and the dead weight of their shared lover. They stopped at the most stable-seeming structure. Luckily, it was also the nearest. It was a single-story, bedraggled remnant of better times. The paint had long since faded, and the closed door had gaps large enough for lizards to crawl through. More than once, Lily caught glimpses of one slipping in and out as they neared. She noticed a light peering from underneath the door. "Hang in there, Miles, you two Shakes," she said with a nod to her partners. She thumped on the door as she held Miles tightly to her left side. "Lucky for me, he isn't a big man. Else I never would have made it this far. We would never have made it this far." She glanced down. The light that had seeped from beneath the door had gone dark. "Hello? Is someone home?" She called out, waiting for a response. She hoped to hear someone and feared that she would receive silence. Shakes, eyes still firmly planted on the ground at her feet, had not said a word on their trek from the wreckage. "Cold," she muttered and shivered ostentatiously. "Hello?" Lily hollered again, cautiously pushing the door open. Faintly, she heard the words, "Simonin," and then the trailing sounds of children playing and laughing were followed by silence. The house, little more than a cabin, was a single-roomed building. Firewood was piled haphazardly near the door, and there was an old, pock-marked dining table in the center of the room. The only other furniture was a small cot set in the corner. Lily didn't like it. This place made her skin crawl, but she didn't see any other choice but to stay the night. There was a single kerosene lantern on the table and 2 settings. Silverware and plates set, as if the owners of the house had just stepped out. Once Lillian set Miles down on the cot, she spoke in short, concise language to get Shakes sitting at the table. It's like I'm talking to my 3-year-old sister. She's still shivering though. That's not fucking good. She refused to think about it further. Shakes was always the brain. Lantern's still hot. The finding sent chills up Lillian's spine. She said it expectantly, glancing at Shakes, hoping that she would contribute something, but her eyes were glued to the table. The only sign of life was when her teeth chattered. Lily turned the knob on the lantern, ignoring the fact that the lantern was warm to the touch. With a small squeak, the lantern lit the room. Lily scooted it closer to Shakes in the hopes that it would help warm her. There you go, Jen. I hope it helps. Now let me see if there's any food hereabouts. First, she turned to check on Miles and felt his neck for a pulse. She was relieved to find one there. It was weak, but it was there. Shit on him if he dies. It's his fault we're here. Anyways. He's the one who had to get greedy with the boss. She fumed because it was only half true. It had been her idea, but it was his guts that had put her idea into action. There was one rule in their line of work: don't screw with the big boys. Not only had their little gang done just that, but they'd been caught red-handed. Caught with their hands in the proverbial cookie jar. And where had that got them? 2,000 miles from home in the high desert, shot to shit. In fucking 7 troughs, whatever the hell that means. All of them were hurt, and she doubted that Miles would make it through the night, even if he was a tough bastard for a little guy. She rubbed absently at the wounds on her arms, compliments of their wrecked imperial phaeton. Daw. She worried for Jen. Jen was hurt bad, real bad. But Jen had neither the know-how nor the supplies to do much about it. They had met as girls, on the wrong side of the tracks in Chicago. They had grown into fast friends, and then best friends. Inevitably, they had gravitated from trouble at school into more damning activities. Both danced in and out of illegal activities, neither of them balking at such things as prostitution or facilitating armed robberies. No one ever suspects the pretty girl that dressed respectfully of being a lookout or getaway driver. It had seemed like the natural step for her to seek out Machine Gun Jack, a man she knew worked for the big boss himself. He liked our pluck, said we were easy on the eyes, and that he could use us. A noise nearby brought Lily back to the grim reality of today. What was that? Lily's eyes became huge, a feeling washing over her that felt as if someone had walked on her grandmother's grave. They whisper all around. Jen said, her tone so low that Lily had to lean in close to hear her words. Her words were barely above a whisper when she repeated them over and over. Good Jesus, Lily laughed, holding a hand to her chest. I don't care for this place too much, and God damn it if you didn't startle the shit out of me. She laughed again, an attempt at trying to shake the ominous feeling that clung to her. Ignoring the whispers and the shadows that clung to the edges of her sight, they were there until she turned her head, then nothing. Nothing would be there except for the fickle illumination offered by the lantern's glow. Good Lord, Shakes. Your lips are almost purple, they're so damned blue. She held a hand to Jen's forehead, and although Jen's shivering had diminished, she was cold, frozen to the touch. She felt a small breeze pass over her left shoulder, and then she heard the caterwauling of a cat in the distance, no more than a quarter mile from the cabin. Lily turned her attention to Miles and the cot. Sorry, Miles, Lily apologized, peeling the blankets from the cot around him. Jen needs these more than you do. She bundled Jen, an arduous task, as Jen was in no state to assist. Shake's eyes stared straight ahead, while occasionally muttering words beneath her breath that Lily, either could not understand or was too tired to decipher. Once bundled with just her eyes, mouth, and nose protruding, she appeared either very young or as an old withered husk of a woman by the feeble lantern light. "Hang in there, girl." Lily grasped her shoulder, fighting back a torrent of tears. What's done is done. Jen had always been the stronger of the two girls. Lily had always felt more brittle. A branch of an oak tree, strong until it needs to bend and then cracking, it snaps. Jen was more a willow tree. She'd bend clear down to the ground, but she'd never break. We shouldn't have killed that guard. That's when everything turned to shit. The wind, an irritant until this point that Lily had been content to ignore, was a howling behemoth of sound. A nearby bush or tree touched branches to the cabin in an irritating, repetitive sound. Ik, tok, tikin, tok, tikin, tots. She pulled down the blanket that served as a cover for the one window, overlooking the hillsides below. She thought she saw a small black-furred creature scurrying away and heard the screaming of a cat, but she could not be sure over the sounds of the wind. The night was dark, and strive as they might, her eyes could not uncover the darkness below. She could see the tops of the sagebrush and rabbit brush bowing in the winds, and little else. "Forgive me, Father," she whispered aloud as she stole the bread that had been placed on the table. Still fresh. She broke off half and fed it to Jen. Still not herself, and alarmingly pale. She gave no indication that she heard any of the words that Lily said, nor did she babble any longer. Eventually, Lily's eyes refused to focus on anything around her. Her head felt as if it was being squeezed between two enormous boulders, and her eyelids felt as if they weighed 1,000 pounds each. She didn't even have the energy to complain. Imagine that, a Lily so tired and bruised that she could not even complain. Despite how tired she was, she smiled at the imaginary voice of Shakes. It was exactly what she would say, if she could. Smiling, she took the chair next to Shakes and opened her mouth in a giant yawn. She was so exhausted that she didn't even remember falling asleep, let alone note all the small scrapes and cuts that coated her body. The second half of bread still in her hand. It was all at the edge of her mind, vaguely discomforting, but lesser a call to that of rest. Shortly after, Jen Shakes Maleo, Lily's dearest friend, gasped for breath, and with a small whimper, she breathed her last breath in this world. Small pools of blood had seeped through her clothes and beneath her chair. Her head lay, resting on the table, and it would appear in the morning that she had but gone to sleep. Miles' breaths too grew shaky, his skin waxy with shock as his body fought to keep him amongst the living. A dim miasmic force coalesced into the visible spectrum, but there were none awake and living to witness. It clutched at Miles' helpless body and possessed. "I feel like hell," Miles grumbled, sitting up gingerly, prying open his eyelids. His face creased with worry. His motions across the room to the table were an awkward caricature of natural movement. His every movement stiff and sharp, such as a marionette wielded by an amateur puppeteer. "I won't let you hurt her," Shakes said, her form glowing softly, her eyes as fierce in death as they had been in life. "Oh, girlie, I just need a body. Yours is gone, and hers is all that is left." A chuckle erupted from what once was Miles. "You can't stop me." Jen did not waste any more words, but a hot burst of light was her answer. Miles' empty body toppled to the floor, and both spirits were gone. In the early rays of dawn, Lily found herself alone, her friends both dead. She sobbed until her whole body ached. No longer the same girl that had once had a friend and protector named Jen. The day of the ritual comes with the clearest sky they've had in a long time. Alicia and Orion prepare together, not saying a word. Tears dry on both of their faces, a sensation neither of them have experienced in years. Orion throws up outside while Alicia covers her eye bags with pencil and powder. The outfits chosen for them are itchy and uncomfortable, hardly suited for the long hike through the woods that awaits them. When they finally step outside, cloaked townspeople paint both their faces and pull veils over their heads. A lump forms in Orion's throat, and Alicia's fingers tremble where the hilt of her sword would normally be. Unknown hands much larger than theirs draw a knife across both their palms. They murmur a prayer, backed by the other townsfolk droning an old hymn under their breath. We send the children of the Castillos for your choosing. May the harvest be bountiful. May the blood welcome you. The townspeople repeat the sentiment. Red drips onto the ground, and those same hands push and guide them towards the entrance of the woods. Alicia glances at him through the black mesh of her veil and offers him her hand. He takes it, their blood mingling sticky and wet. They step forward as one, trembling radiating up the other's arms. Darkness enshrouds them the moment they step into the woods. The townspeople disappear in their wake, the heat of familiarity gone with them. Alicia walks cautiously, pulling Orion behind her until her foot catches on a root and she stumbles, yanking him with her. Let me go in front, Orion mumbles. All his midnight hunting sessions make him sure-footed as he plots out the path ahead. No immediate response comes from Alicia as she follows, and he refuses to look back at her. There's no specific direction towards the center. It was repeated 1,000 times in their youth, to walk until whatever's in here decides they're ready. The forest is quiet, but Orion isn't unused to it. In fact, he finds a misguided peace in it, despite knowing what waits for them. Everything is larger than they are, and they wade deeper and deeper into the ocean of a forest. For once, Orion is more in his element than Alicia. It feels like drowning, existing somewhere this expansive. Alicia's eyes are wide, flitting from the gaps between the trees, but Orion trains his gaze on the ground. Her breathing devolves into short gasps the longer they walk, and she grips his hand like a lifeline. Thick groves of mushrooms grow on the bases of the trees, and Orion has taken to following the thin stream of water that cuts across the ground. He doesn't dare drink it. He's not that much of a fool, but water always leads somewhere. It's better than nothing. How do you know so much about the forest? Alicia says quietly. We haven't gone out exploring together in a long time. The lump in Orion's throat swells, but he doesn't stop walking. I found a gun in one of the shipments from out of town. I wanted to learn how to use it. He swallows, eyes burning. I didn't want you to know. Oh. He assumed she would ask why he didn't tell her, but she doesn't say anything. They just keep walking in silence. The woods grow thicker, and if possible, darker. Tree trunks the size of houses take up the forest floor, branches stretching up beyond their vision. They walk for hours, or maybe days. Neither of them stop, but the ground grows tenebrous as Alicia locks eyes with every prey animal hidden in the brush, and pressure builds at the back of Orion's head that he wishes was from dehydration. At this point, Alicia is nothing but a shadow behind him. The blood between their palms dries as time goes on, their wounds connecting and scabbing together. If she's still breathing, he can't tell. Her hand is calloused in his, and he can feel the edges of her fingernails bitten to the quick. His eyes blur, vision going in and out of focus. Everything starts to bleed together, and his mind fogs over. Alicia drips with perspiration, her hands trembling wildly. The trees show no sign of thinning, and even Orion starts to see pricks of eyes in the corners of his swirling vision. He's never ventured this deep into the woods before, never crossed that invisible line that separated him from whatever's out here. Sweat trickles down his back, but there's no hope of a breeze down here. The air feels like it hasn't moved in thousands of years. Alicia stops dead. Orion. It's close. Orion snaps back to reality, haze clearing from his mind. For the first time, he turns to look back. He hasn't taken the time to really look at her in the past few years, but even in a glance at her now, it takes him by surprise how much she's changed. The ceremonial veil over her face is torn from sharp branches, revealing the gauntness of her face. Her eyes are wider than Orion has ever seen them, her pupils blown impossibly wide. Every detail of her body or face reminds him of their childhood. Vividly, he remembers clumsily shearing brambles and thorns out of her hair, messily cutting it to a jagged bob around her ears. She cried holding the pieces in her hands, and Orion can't remember it happening again since then. It's never grown past her ears in all the years since he first cut it for her. Hidden under her clothes is a scar that wraps from her hip up her chest. It's a scar that should have been Orion's. That hunt is nothing but a memory of blood and fear in his mind. He had been waiting for the blow with a sick satisfaction, hoping maybe that would lend some credibility to his name. It took him so long to realize that the pain was never going to hit. Alicia had taken the wound for him. Bitterness curls through him, but guilt pulls behind it. She saved him. By all rights he should be grateful, but some small part of him still wishes that scar was his. He snaps out of reverie when she jerks his hand hard. "Did you hear that?" Glancing around wildly, he looks for some beast or creature, and instead meets the eyes of a doe. With a sigh of relief, he stills and points it out. "Look, I bet there's a fawn nearby." Alicia loosens the death grip she has on his hand. The doe bolts into the trees, hoping to lead them away from her baby. Orion hadn't realized how fast his heart was beating until he feels his own pulse in Alicia's palm. She breathes out shakily and shakes her head as if that will dispel the fear. Still half in the middle of looking for the fawn in the underbrush, it takes him by surprise when Alicia speaks again. "I can barely breathe in here. How did you come out to practice every night without suffocating?" He shrugs. "Didn't notice it, I guess." A lie, but hopefully a harmless one. The air was so thick when he came to hunt that he spent days doing nothing but relearning how to inhale. He aligned his breathing to the cicadas and crickets, and taught himself to calm down that way. There are no cicadas here. There hasn't been a single chirp or insect song since Alicia saw the deer. Alicia's head jerks up. "It's here. Run, run!" She flies in front of him in a single bound, taking off before he has time to react, and disappearing between trees and brush. The movement rips the scab forming between their palms off, and Orion winces for a split second too long. She disappears into the tree line. "Come back!" He tears after her as fast as he can. When he rounds one of the massive trees, he becomes aware of what exactly Alicia was running from. Or rather, running towards. What he immediately fundamentally understands to be the creature in the woods, the patron of Vastrile, looms before him, Alicia folded in its wings. She's not struggling, and instead reaches a hand towards the horror. At just a glance it could be mistaken for a stag or a bear, but the moment Orion starts tracking the details of its body, his stomach curdles. Its wings aren't like any Orion has ever seen, rotting and molting and regrowing before his eyes, black like mold. An agglomeration of roots spread from its chest in a vague circular shape, but there is no physical form beneath it. Just roots and bone and rotten wings. The skin on its face sags, more like hide draped over a skull than flesh. Antlers crest from the creature's head, with more points than any he's seen on a normal stag. Gray Spanish moss dangles from its face, and at the edges, its body seems to merge with the foliage behind it. Wisteria dangles from its mouth. But when he looks closer, it doesn't look like there's an opening in its face where the flowers are. He follows the blooms until, in the shadow behind them, he sees bone-white canines. Its deer head is nothing more than a mask. Its mouth is not where the flowers are. Orion's breath catches in his chest, and the creature's maw cracks open. Alicia goes limp, her head snapping backward at an unnatural angle. Her eyes are wide, flitting around desperately before landing on him. A broken noise comes out of her throat, a ragged gasp or the beginning of a scream. Holding Alicia in cloven hooves and tattered wings, the creature brings her to its mouth. It makes eye contact with him as its roots wrap around her, winding across her body. Orion hasn't seen her look this small in years, and that unsettles him more than anything else. She's perfectly still in its arms, nothing but a low groan indicating she's even alive. Then it speaks. The sounds coming from its throat don't sound like words, but instead like syllables screamed out and spliced together to make a word. But Orion understands, and Alicia understands. Rarely indeed, that a second child suits this fate better than the first. It pauses, listening. Perhaps you will last longer than the others. Alicia realizes what it's going to do before Orion does. Her body seizing like electricity runs through her. Another noise cracks from her chest as though her ribs are constricting to push the sound out, and the creature's mouth opens wider. He screams in tandem with her as it pulls her head into its mouth and bites down. His body stops working, ground yawing open beneath him as it eats her. There is a horrific cracking of bones and squelching of flesh, and then it's just Orion and the patron of Vast Trail. It looks at him, muzzle wet with blood, and the absence of Alicia stands stark between them. In a split second, all of Orion's fear turns to fury. On instinct, he reaches for his gun, and the realization that it's not there only enrages him further. He rushes towards the beast, but it lets out a screeching, disjointed noise that he places as a laugh. Orion flies into it, ripping at the pelt draped across its skull. His fingers bore through rotten flesh, digging into its body as though he'll find Alicia buried under its skin. For every layer of tissue that he pierces, however, it undulates and grows back faster. Give her back! Orion doesn't notice the hand around his throat until it hauls him up and away. A moment ago, he would have sworn it was a hoof, but he's undoubtedly suspended by thin, emaciated fingers that recede into a body of writhing undergrowth. Its mouth opens wide, rancid breath rolling over Orion in a wave. An eerie scream-speak emanates from its throat, but the blood in Orion's skull pounds too loud for him to understand what it's saying. Whispered syllables and howled consonants fill his head as the creature glitches. Its body contorts, spasming into something smaller and unfamiliar, then jerks back to its previous form. The hand on his throat convulses, for a moment no longer flesh but a cloven hoof wrapped in roots. Suddenly it releases him, its body snapping and seizing. Orion grasps at his throat, heaving for air. Dizzy from lack of oxygen, his mind can't put together the pieces of what's unfolding in front of him. He could swear that it's Alicia standing in front of him for a moment, with terrible wings binding her like a nervous system to the forest. Then it's the patron before him again, with its massive maw split open. The sound coming from its mouth crescendos until Orion has to tear his gaze away to cover his ears. It just keeps screaming, howling louder and louder as Orion squeezes his eyes shut and covers his ears. The sound is inescapable, searing through his body until his ears bleed. Blood thunders in his head as his heart beats a prey animal's hymn in his chest. All he can find the strength to do is press his ears harder over his head and hold his eyes shut. He doesn't know how long it is that he stays like that. How long it is before the creature starts speaking. Oh, Aryan. It shudders the sound out, the syllables rattling through its throat like wind through the grass. Aryan, it says again, and this time he can hear Alicia's voice under it. He keeps his eyes shut as he forces himself to correct, rasps his name in Alicia's voice. Look at me. It groans, each word dragged out like a body on stone. Orion, Aryan, Orion. Each syllable joins together to what he knows is his name, but the emphasis on each part is wrong each time. Orion, 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 Orion. But its uncanny imitations inch closer to reality until it's speaking in Alicia's voice. Orion. He knows it's not her. He knows. He just heard the damn thing practicing her voice. But the possibility is too much. With a pit yawing in his stomach, he forces himself to look. Alicia stands in front of him, her shirt ripped away to reveal her scar peeking from under it. Eyes brown and bold meet his. The earlier days of the apocalypse was only chaos. Death and smoke gripped the air. I could feel it stale all around me. It coated my skin, my clothes, my hair. Fear pulsed through every vein. Terror gripped every muscle. Dread gnawed every brain. It was melted into the eyes of everyone you passed. When would it happen to me? When will I watch it happen to someone I love? What could we have done differently? Thoughts that would plague my mind over and over. My new reality. The dead no longer stayed dead, and those bitten became deranged, unreachable. They would rip out their hair, scream into the night, pick the skin off their bones until they would be covered in dark, bloody scabs that never seemed to heal. The worst was when they came for you. Their eyes empty pits as they chased after you with never-ending endurance and unnatural speed. Nothing like seeing a crippled old woman hit by a truck going 40 mph, only to rise again unfazed, keeping pace with a teenager as she drags her mangled foot behind her. The only advantage left was the inability to use their brains. They couldn't climb ladders or trees, they couldn't open doors or sneak through windows. And in this world we had to use every advantage we could get. In those early days, everyone still held onto their humanity, the memories of their old life still fresh. I remember thinking that things may eventually go back to normal. Eventually, where my biggest problem was maybe forgetting my lunch at home or something as juvenile as what to wear to my meeting. However, everything this new world touched was tainted. Cities burned, homes abandoned, our population destroyed, leaving only a handful of us left. Fortunate would not a word I would use for the survivors. What I was fortunate for, however, was the group I had found a few months prior. They were mostly good people in present standards. We didn't rob from the living, we didn't murder the innocent, or strike down the weak. We took care of one another and watched each other's back. Everyone pulled their weight from going on supply runs, to working the garden, to gathering firewood. The group consisted of 15 of us who camped deep in a national forest near Colorado Springs. The supply runs were little more than a day's trip, and our traveling group consisted of 3 people always. I would go as often as I could, preferring to stay on the move to keep my shifting thoughts at bay. We always played it safe and quiet, successfully making it 5 months without losing a member. This should have brought me an ounce of comfort, that it has been a while since we lost someone, so it must mean we were getting wiser. Although all I could think to count on was luck, and any day that luck would eventually run out and disaster would strike. We were camped out in some loft apartments bordering the forest. Paul was on watch duty while Libby slept on the couch adjacent to mine. I remember falling asleep with blankets wrapped around me that reminded me of a moldy scent that used to cling to clothes that were left in the washer longer than they should have been. It used to bother me using strangers' belongings like their clothes or blankets, especially when the entire place still smelled of old cigar smoke. However, I came to be grateful for the comfort of being in a semi-safe, warm spot for the night. I woke with a jerk, jarring myself out of my typical reoccurring nightmare. Sweat forced my dark hair to cling to my forehead. Panting, I mindlessly reached for the weapon beside me. My hands found only a butcher knife I snagged from the kitchen before falling to sleep. Remembering I had given Paul my handgun for his rotation of watch, since it was less bulky than the shotgun he often slugged around. I tried to calm my racing heart, but something had just felt wrong. I looked over, seeing Libby's still sleeping form. I started to stand, wondering how long I had been asleep. Surely, Paul was well past his shift. I reached the window, pulling back the blinds to find gray light pouring through the opening. My heart sank. Paul was supposed to wake me hours ago. I didn't see him anywhere in the still dark living room. I silently walked over to Libby and gave her a gentle shake before stepping back, knowing she slept with a knife under her pillow. She sat up with a gasp, her blonde hair frizzing out from her worn braid. Something is wrong. Paul should have woken me hours ago. She stared at me blankly, my words taking a few seconds longer to comprehend as she shook sleep from her mind. "Where is he?" she asked, blinking vigorously. Her green eyes roamed the shadows of the living room. I had liked Libby from the moment I met her a few months prior. She had found us on her own, days after losing her partner to a minor infection that would have only required a thorough cleaning and maybe a few antibiotics before the outbreak. I've never asked, but she couldn't be much younger than me, her youth apparent in her round cheeks. Paul, on the other hand, was well older than us bother. He looked closer to my father's age. Gray hairs dusting his hair and reaching down into his beard. It was out of character for him to wander off on his own. We survived by following strict rules that I know that he knew, because I had gone on more runs with Paul than anyone else in the group. "I'm not sure. Help me look around." She nodded and tossed her blanket to the side, wobbling a bit as she stood. Once we were sure that he was nowhere inside, my cold panic really did begin to take hold. We quickly gathered our limited supplies. I carried Paul's shotgun and bag with mine, thankful that he had always packed light. Outside, the light from the sun began to coat everything in a golden hue. The chill, damp air hung from everything from the night before. I moved as silently as I could, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of Paul. It was mornings like this that seemed to deceive you and hide the horrors of the world we lived in. I would have loved a day like this before the outbreak. The birds chirping, the air smelling of fresh pine, the clouds peacefully drifting through the sky. If only a heavy sense of dread didn't cling around me throat like a noose. I rounded the corner of one of the buildings with Libby close behind. Before me stretched a courtyard, a few trees stretched tall, casting long shadows. The trees were surrounded by a few dry patches of grass and shrubs. I had to shift my head a bit to the right, but I saw him standing there, maybe 50 feet away. His name was on the tip of my tongue. It was nearly out of my mouth in a whisper before something slammed my jaw shut. The way he stood gave me pause. His neck seemed to hang from his shoulders. The way he stood, his arms dangling empty at his sides, unmoving. I began to reach out to stop Libby, but before I could, she slammed into me. The knife she gripped in her hand clanged loudly through the still air into the shotgun strapped to my back. The breath in my lungs left me like someone had just punched me in the stomach. I looked to where Paul stood, horror clogged in my throat, as his head whipped towards us. What had happened next came in a blur. Minutes passed in seconds, my body numb as my instinct took control of my muscles. I grabbed Libby's arm and began to sprint as fast as I could. We ran across a street, hearing Paul's footfalls quickly gaining on us. I refused to turn around. I didn't trust blindly running into one of dark doorways that could hold any number of threats. Instead, my eyes scanned for anything we could climb. Relief spread over me as I spotted a ladder that hung from one of the buildings. I urged Libby ahead of me, letting her climb the ladder first as I turned, planting my feet. I raised the rifle, cocking it back before aiming it at Paul's head. I fired before my fear could choke me. His nearness unsettled me. He dropped hard to the ground, unmoving and lifeless. His body skidding against the pavement, twisting unnaturally as it landed. I turned, climbing the ladder after Libby. My mind played over what I saw before the bullet ripped through Paul. In a flash, I saw blood that coated Paul's throat, but not from a bite. It looked more like a slash from a blade. I tried to focus on the placement of my hands on the rungs of the ladder, but my mind buzzed. Finally reaching the top, I froze, overlooking onto the roof, where Libby stood motionless. Before her stood a man. His hands reached out before him, as if he were trying to calm a spooked animal. Without thought, I pointed the rifle directly at him. Below me, I was faintly aware of the infected down below gathering at the base of the ladder. Their frenzies, gargled sounds reaching my ears. However, all my focus was on the man on the roof. His attention turned to me, and in that instant, shock radiated through me. I knew this man. I recognized his dark brown eyes from another lifetime ago, when his eyes didn't hold circles bags and his skin seemed to hang from his bones. He had worked in my department. For years we had walked the same halls and attended the same meetings. His name formed on my mouth without though, as I slowly lowered the rifle. Jesse? His eyes widened at the sound of his name. He lowered his arms. He looked different, almost unrecognizable as he stared back at me. Libby and I joined him on the roof. Libby silently sat, staring blankly ahead towards the slow-moving clouds. I, however, stood with Jesse, staring over towards the small town that was now crawling with infected, their screams and snarls echoing through the streets below. "Bad call firing the rifle," Jesse said. His word came out a harsh whisper. His tone disturbed me. No person was the same after the outbreak, but something about Jesse seemed off. Hysteria seemed to have set into his once warm eyes. His jerky movements made me feel as if he was close to the edge of insanity. This man was not the one I had known in my life prior. I wanted to take Libby and leave as soon as I could, but the streets below were unsafe. I tried to calm my nerves and talk soothingly to the man, giving no indications to my fear, other than the bullet already loaded into the chamber. I know I regret it now, but I just wanted to give us enough time to reach the ladder. His hand twitched at his side. "Well, look what you did." He angrily pointed at the street below. When he moved his arm, my gaze drifted to his hip where a gun poked from waistband. I had noticed it before. However, now I could see it now in detail. I inhaled a sharp breath as realization soaked in. I grabbed the shotgun slowly, bringing it around my front. The motion caused his head to snap in my direction. "Where did you get that gun?" I asked, my voice coming out shaky. Anger twisted his face as he grabbed it the same second I took aim with the rifle. Libby stood swiftly at the quick change of our position. The gun he held was my gun, the one that I had given to Paul the night prior. "I found it," Jesse said, his voice coming out in a snarl. The image of Paul running towards me replayed in my mind. His throat slit. "You killed Paul," I said, bothered by how my voice quivered. Jesse shook his head hard, as if he were trying to shake a thought out of his head. His arm twitched again, Nausea rolled up my throat, terrified of this crazed man before me. His face kept twitching, and he jerked again, using his free hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead. I have seen my share of evil men in this world, but something about Jesse was different. That is when I saw it, a trickle of blood running down his forearm. Poking out from his sleeve was just the outline of a bite mark. "You're infected, aren't you, Jesse?" Anger contorted his face again as I said his name. He was on the edge of turning. I could see that now. His twitch movement, his sunken eyes, his pale sweat-soaked skin. All signs that a person was infected. I placed my hand on the trigger ready to pull it, well aware that if I fired then he would too. We would most likely both go down and Libby would be alone. However, at least she would be alive. "Don't do this, please." My voice came out hoarse, pleading. Just then something shifted in his eye. Clarity. For just a brief moment, the old kind Jesse I knew was there. "I'm sorry." He looked scared. Then he pulled the gun back, aiming it at his own head, and fired. The force knocked him sideways, and I watched as his body tumbled over the side of the roof. Libby let out a shriek as I stood in silent horror, my hand clamped over my mouth. I ran to the edge, peering over at his disfigured body as it lay 3 stories down. It took only seconds for the horde to surround him and began ripping into his flesh. I stepped back, nearly tripping on thin air. I seen some dark things. I was no stranger to tragedy. However, it was something I could never get used to. The sound of his croaking apology replayed in my mind. Sorry for what? For killing Paul. For not making his bite known sooner. I wondered if he had even known what he had even done to Paul. I know the infection took hold before the person was completely lost, stealing bit by bit until there was nothing left. I knew I would see Jesse again. He would eventually join me in my nightmares like all the others. Him and Paul would haunt me until I met my own fate one day. I saw him for the first time in 20 years during my last real date with Laurent, in Café Ombre. I stood, turned for my coat, and bumped into the man walking by. "Sorry," we said in unison, and our eyes locked. His were orange. He was already disappearing amongst the crowd. Laurent was calling my name. I ignored him, maneuvered my way toward the stranger, reached out, grabbed his arm. He stopped, allowed me to turn him around. I knew those eyes. "Have we met before?" He smiled, slow and warm. My heart stopped, fangs grazing his lower lip. I should have been scared, but I felt safe. His eyes twinkled knowingly, and then, just like that, he was gone, and my fingers clutched the empty air. I elbowed my way back through the cafe and out the door. "Eloise, wait!" Laurent caught up with me, panting, my coat in his arms. What's going on?" "I know that man." "Where from?" I shook my head. "It's been 20 years. He looks the same." Worry etched into his brow. "Eloise, what are you saying?" I stopped, turned to him. "He looks exactly like the man who killed my parents." His face paled. And I saw his fangs, Laurent. Laurent pursed his lips. "Eloise, not this again. I mean just then, at the cafe. He showed them to me." Laurent eyed me, fear mingling with worry. I reclaimed my coat, rummaging inside its pockets. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to work. It's the middle of the night." I pulled out my keys and turned the corner. Laurent didn't follow. In my bookshop, L'Amoureuse des Livres, I pulled out every single book regarding local legends, mythical creatures, vampires, It was hours before I found anything useful. I called Laurent. Eloise? I found something. I'll pick you up tomorrow at sunset. Silence then, Eloise. It's 4 in the morning. I glanced at my watch. So it was. Sorry, I didn't realize. A sigh. I'll be ready. Go to bed. So, what are we doing here? Laurent and I were parked on the end of Sanguine Boulevard. We're going door to door. Why? I handed him one of the books I'd studied that morning, The Vampire of Eternelment Point. This book was written by a local paranormal investigator, Darian Clement, claiming that a vampire lives in this town, on this very street. Laurent shot me a dubious glance. I pressed on. The vampire's name is Antoine. He's described as... I grabbed the book from Laurent, flipped to one of the pages I'd marked. A tall, lithe figure, dark wavy hair slicked back, eyes an unnatural amber. Tall, wavy black hair, orange eyes, just like the man who killed my parents and the man from the cafe. And considering that this street is only 2 streets away from your childhood home. Exactly. And what's this reporter doing now? He's missing, presumed dead. Laurent let out a breath, and I blushed. He disappeared shortly after this book was published. And you're still looking into this, why? Despite his admonishment, I beamed. So, you believe Antoine killed him for spilling his secrets? No, I just... Laurent sighed, dragged his hand down his face. I'm worried about you, Eloise. I don't want you getting killed. I stepped out of the car. I won't. He followed suit. How do you know? Antoine could have killed me when I was 5. But he didn't. I approached the first door. He saved me, Laurent. Not only from the fire, he saved me from them. My parents. My father, who would chain me to a table in the shed whenever I'd eaten too much chocolate or fallen asleep in front of the TV. And my mother, who'd enjoyed putting out her cigarettes on my arms and legs. The official story goes that I'd burned down the garden shed, killing my abusive parents within. Then, worried about the consequences, fabricated the story of the tall man with wavy black hair and orange eyes and fangs, who had sucked both my parents dry in front of me, then carried me out of the burning shed, the blaze started by the cigarette my mother had been smoking, and put me down on the neighbor's porch. Nobody believed me except Laurent. But even he drew the line at fangs and blood-sucking, attributing them to a child's overactive imagination. What will you do if you find him? I'm going to talk to him. You're not serious. I need answers, Laurent. At the expense of your life. I ignored him and knocked on the door. This is a waste of time, Laurent said as I knocked on the 11th door. Am I risking my life or wasting my time? It can't be both. I felt Laurent's glare as the door swung open, revealing a smartly dressed man in all black. Can I help you? Hello. I plastered on my customer service smile. Are you the owner of this establishment? I work for him. State your business. We sell tinted windows. His smile was plastic. I forced my voice to remain cheery. Heavily, tinted, block out the sun nearly completely. I froze, my voice dying in my throat. There he was, at the end of the corridor, orange eyes piercing mine even from this distance, penetrating my very mind and soul. I was in my childhood backyard. An intense heat on my back, the garden shed up in flames. In my arms, a girl with big brown liquid eyes, bruises on her wrists, burns on her arms. It was me. I was looking at me, through his eyes, the day he saved me. Then we were on the neighbor's porch, and I was putting her down and tucking her hair behind her ears and saying in his quiet voice, "Don't worry, Eloise, you're safe now. I promise." We're not interested? Back on the doorstep, the man in black was closing the door. Please leave and never come back. Wait. The latch slid shut. It's him, I breathed. Eloise? Laurent's fingers grazed my arm. Are you all right? You look pale. It was Antoine. He killed my parents. You're sure? I saw it. He showed me. Just then, I started down the street to my car. Showed you what? Laurent called. I need to speak with him. Alone. Catch him while he's out. How are you going to do that? A stakeout. Laurent stared at me. You mean stalking. You're going to stalk a killer. I got in the car. He'll need to eat, right? Hunt. He'll have to come out at some point. We were parked amongst the bushes across the street from Antoine's house. I was alone. Laurent had left 10 minutes prior to get snacks. Movement from the house. The man who worked for Antoine getting into his car, driving down the street, the same way Laurent had gone. My pulse quickened. I turned my attention back to the house. A great rev, then a loud thud. My heart leapt into my throat. I opened my door, but the car was coming back and I shut it again, shrinking behind the steering wheel. Antoine's worker parked and returned inside. I waited another 10 seconds before leaping out of the car and down the street. There was a small mound on the side of the road, a huddled form with blonde hair shining under the light of a street lamp. My heart stopped, my blood growing cold. It was Laurent. In the emergency department, doctors swarmed around us as Laurent was laid on a stretcher and pushed through the double doors. Will he survive? I cried to the one closest to me. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. To my relief, the car was missing from the driveway when I returned. I pounded on the front door so hard my fist ached. He pulled it open, orange eyes growing wide, as he took in the sight of me. Eloise? He whispered. You're covered in blood. I need your help. Without thinking, I reached out with a hand still sticky with drying blood and grabbed his, clean and soft, before leading him down the driveway to my car. Get in. The passenger seat was soaked in blood. What happened? Laurent's in the hospital. I started the engine. We need to go, now. We sped down the street, Antoine's gaze on the side of my face. Eloise, tell me what happened. The man who works for you. My voice was low, accusing. He ran him over. Marcel? He looked horrified. He doesn't work for me. He's another vampire. He was sent to keep me in check. There it was. Confirmation that I had been right all along. So nonchalantly put, another vampire. I would have laughed if Laurent's blood wasn't crusting upon my skin. Keeping you in check? He's against my making myself known to you. Making himself known. You've been watching me. A nervous chuckle. I caught another glimpse of his fangs. More. Watching over you. I scoffed. My guardian angel? The vampire? He nodded. Did you think it was mere coincidence, our bumping into each other at Café Ombre? When he put it like that, I'm sorry, he said suddenly. This is all my fault. I refused to let him kill you, and his price was that I never saw you again. This was an example, a warning. Why does he want to kill me? I cried. I'm nobody. You're a loose end. I should have killed you 20 years ago. Why didn't you? I was going to. His voice dropped, barely audible over the screeching tires. But when you looked at me, he paused, his eyes glazing over. Most people look at me with fear in their eyes. But you looked at me like I was your savior. Tears dripped into my lap. You were? I whispered. A tiny smile flickered across his face. The thought hit me like a revelation. This vampire cared for me. He'd fought against his very nature to save me, stood against his own kind to protect me. He would help me now. I was sure of it. I need you to save Laurent. We careened to a halt outside the hospital. I switched off the engine, turned to him. His had fallen. Heal him. You can do that, can't you? He stared straight ahead. I can, but please, Antoine, I'll do anything. At the mention of his name, his gaze snapped to mine, anguished. I'll give you whatever you want. Eloise, what do you want with me, Antoine? To make you a vampire. I froze. The life of a vampire. Killing every day just to survive. Strength, flight, speed, telekinesis, immortality. An eternal life with Laurent Dotguay. It was my fault he was in the hospital. But now, I could fix it. Okay. Antoine eyed me. You're sure? I nodded frantically. Yes, but Laurent first. His eyes widened. He looked torn. Eloise, turn him into a vampire. Silence, save for my ragged breathing. Antoine stared at me, his eyes silently pleading. Do it for me, I whispered. Even as the words left my lips, I knew he couldn't refuse. Please? Then you can have me. His resolve melted before my eyes. His shoulders slumped, his head hung, his eyes lowered, even his sigh was small and quiet. All right. We strode through the emergency department, Antoine's face tight with concentration, and nurses and doctors dropped their tasks and walked blankly out the door. This way, he said. Inside a brightly lit room, Laurent lay alone on the table, blood pooled in wide-open wounds. I guarded the door as Antoine took his position. Ready? A shudder ran down my spine. I nodded. A mixture of horror and awe tangled within me as Antoine lifted his wrist to Laurent's lips and brought a sharp nail to his vein. A grip on my upper arm so tight, I cried out, and I was yanked backwards against something fleshy yet cold. Antoine's head jerked upwards, his face terror-stricken. Marcel, no. You broke your promise, Antoine. Icy breath curled around my ear. I suppressed a scream. The terror on Antoine's face morphed into a look of horrified understanding. This wasn't a warning, he whispered. It was a trap. I knew you couldn't resist helping her. The grip tightened around my arms, sharp nails drawing blood. And now, she'll die for your weakness. A piercing pain in my neck, and Antoine cried out. My blood was being sucked out of me, being pulled through every artery, every vein. My head spun. The room swam. Antoine, growing blurrier by the second, glanced frantically around the room, then stopped, his gaze fixed on something. The machine wired to Laurent. The only thing keeping his heart beating. No. I tried to say, but no sound came out as Antoine grabbed the machine and tore it aside, the tubes ripping themselves out of Laurent, jerking his body off the table. My knees buckled, only Marcel's iron grip keeping me upright. The edges of my vision blackened. In my shrinking tube of sight, Antoine picked Laurent up with one hand, then moved like a flash of light to tear Marcel off me. I crashed to the floor, too numb to feel pain. My cheek against the cold tile, I forced one eye open to see Antoine holding Laurent over Marcel's face, blood gushing from the open wounds into Marcel's mouth. Marcel making a horrible gurgling sound, his body thrashing in his immaculate black suit. Then The next few moments came back in flashes. A cold hand on my cheek, soft and gentle, tilting my face upwards, something hot and thick dripping into my mouth, onto my lips, Antoine's face hovering over mine, his voice tender as the day we met, saying, "Don't worry, Eloise. You're safe. I've got you, Den Black." The next time I opened my eyes, I was in my car, my forehead pressed against the window. Even in what I knew to be pitch darkness, I could make out the colors of the wildflowers we sped past. I peeled my face off the window, turned to the driver's seat. Antoine, covered in blood. "Laurent?" I croaked. "I'm sorry." His voice was thick with despair. For a moment, I felt nothing. "You killed him." I had to. "No. It couldn't be. You were supposed to save him. It was the only way to save you." I was angry now. The heat of it flowed through my veins. "Happy now? You've got me all to yourself. Isn't that what you wanted?" "No, that's not." His voice cracked. "I just wanted to keep you safe." In a whisper, I promised I'd keep you safe. My anger subsided even as it arrived. He was hunched over, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles paled. The look on his face, a mixture of broken and manic. Something warm and sticky was running down my cheeks. I wiped it away on the back of my hand. Red. I froze, brought my fingers just under my eyes. Blood. "Oh God! Oh God! It's all right, Eloise. It's normal." "Normal? It's normal for vampires to cry blood." I stared at my fingers, at the blood that had come out of my eyes, the long, sharp nails, the paleness of my skin. My voice shook. I'm a vampire," Antoine said quietly, as though to soften the blow. "Yes." I took a handful of deep breaths, steadying my heartbeat. It was loud, like drums were being played in the car. There were two rhythms, mine and Antoine's. His was slower, steadier than mine, but in a way that seemed forced, like he was trying just as hard as I to remain calm. "Marcel," I finally said to hear something other than those drum beats. "How did you get rid of him?" "I killed him." His voice sounded like his heartbeat. Steady. Even. Forced. "How?" "Laurent's blood. Dead blood is fatal for vampires." He glanced over, his face earnest. "You see? I had no choice." I looked away. "I didn't want to think about Laurent." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe. We're fugitives now." "Because we killed Laurent?" "Because we killed Marcel. The human police are of no concern to us. It's our kind we must worry about. The sentence for killing fellow vampires is death." The human police. Our kind. Antoine must have heard the steady rising of my heartbeat, because he looked at me and said, "Don't worry, Eloise. I'll never let anything happen to you." I was back in the garden shed, carrying a little crying girl away from the blaze. Then in the shadows of the orphanage, watching that girl being teased by a boy. Then in the corner of the boy's room, baring my fangs, making him promise never to bully her again. Then, in the mall, watching a teenage girl wince as her first boyfriend grasped her arm and hissed that next time he would slap her across the face. Then I was outside his front door, snatching him from the steps and drinking him dry. Then, opposite the bookshop as a woman locked up, unaware of the man behind her wielding a knife, and before he could pounce on her, pouncing on him, dragging him into an alleyway, and drinking him too. Back in the car, I turned to Antoine. Slowly, he met my gaze, his own eyes red-rimmed. My guardian angel, the vampire, I'd called him only hours before. He'd watched over me my entire life, and deep inside my thundering heart I knew, even as he sped me away towards places unknown, that he would protect me for eternity. Every 6 years. The night was dark and heavy over the small county of Hesse. The stars were hidden behind a veil of thick clouds, and the wind blew with a chill that cut to the bone. However, the ominous atmosphere did not diminish Vanessa's excitement, a 6-year-old girl for whom this day was one of the most special of her life. Her parents had promised her a surprise, one that, according to them, would change her life forever. The birthday party was held in the main room of the Muller house, decorated with balloons and streamers, though the number of guests was smaller than Vanessa had imagined. Only her parents, her grandfather, and her Aunt Elsa were present. There were no friends, no schoolmates. Something in the air felt dense, as if everyone was waiting for a crucial moment. "Are you ready for your surprise, dear?" her mother asked with a strange smile, as if she knew something Vanessa couldn't understand. "Yes, Mommy," the little girl exclaimed, jumping with excitement. Her father approached, holding a large package wrapped in dark paper. The color of the package wasn't cheerful or festive. Rather, it was unsettling, as if it were made of shadows. Vanessa felt a small shiver run down her spine but ignored it, blinded by excitement. "This is a very special gift, Vanessa," her father said, kneeling in front of her and placing the package in her small hands. "It's a family tradition that at 6 years old you receive this gift. Everyone in our family has received it, and now is your turn." The girl looked at the package with curiosity and some nervousness. She tore it open hurriedly, her hands trembling with excitement. Inside she found a doll, but it wasn't a regular doll. It had an unchanging expression, a carved smile that didn't reach its eyes. It was an old porcelain doll, and although its blue glass eyes seemed real, they had something disturbing about them, as if they were observing beyond reality. "It's pretty," Vanessa said, though something inside her whispered that she should let go of it. "You must hold it tightly and say, 'I accept you, companion,'" her grandfather instructed from his chair with a raspy, grave voice that allowed no argument. Vanessa, with a lump in her throat, obeyed. She grabbed the doll tightly and whispered the words, "I accept you, companion." As soon as the words left her lips, she felt a sudden dizziness. Everything around her began to spin. The ground disappeared beneath her feet, and the lights in the room faded, replaced by total darkness. The air seemed thick, as if she were underwater. She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The darkness enveloped her, and the last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the unyielding smile of the doll. When Vanessa opened her eyes, she was no longer in her living room. The atmosphere was entirely different. She was in a dark and cold place. The walls were made of stone, and the air was filled with the smell of dampness and decay. She slowly sat up, feeling a sharp pain in her head. "Where am I?" she murmured, her voice breaking with fear. Looking around, she realized she was in a cell, with metal bars separating her from a dimly lit hallway by torches. There were no windows, no visible doors, and the only thing accompanying her was the echo of her own movements. Terror took hold of her. She screamed and pounded on the bars with her small hands, but no one responded. It was as if she were completely alone. Hours passed, perhaps days. The notion of time faded. The only company she had were shadows that seemed to move at the edge of her vision, whispering things she couldn't understand. Sometimes, she heard footsteps in the distance, but when she screamed for help, everything returned to an oppressive silence. One night, while curled up in a corner, she heard the sound of something dragging along the hallway. She immediately tensed, her heart pounding frantically. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, hunched over, and its face was covered by a hood that hid its features. She could only see a flash of glowing eyes watching her from the darkness. "You've been chosen, little Vanessa," said a deep, distorted voice. "You're part of the tradition now." Vanessa didn't understand what the figure was talking about, but the sense of danger was overwhelming. She backed away, pressing her back against the wall as the being slowly approached. Its long, thin hands reached out to her, and the girl felt fear paralyze her. "Let me go," she whispered, barely able to speak. But the being didn't stop. Its claws reached her, and with a single touch, her entire body tensed in pain. She felt as if something inside her was being torn out, something she couldn't see or understand. The following days were a whirlwind of traumatic events. Each night, the hooded figure returned, whispering things that made her shiver in terror. Little Vanessa, once full of life and joy, slowly faded away, her mind fractured by the horrors she experienced daily. Until one night, something changed. Instead of the hooded figure, she saw a different shadow. It was small, the size of a child. Vanessa, her heart in her throat, approached the bars and saw something that left her frozen. A girl identical to her, with the same clothes, the same golden curls, but with a smile that was more than sinister. That girl watched her in silence, hidden in the dim light. "Who are you?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. It just watched her with that wicked smile, and then disappeared, fading into the air. The next day, when the cell was opened due to a mistake by the hooded figure, Vanessa seized the opportunity and ran with all her might. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape that place. She ran through endless hallways, feeling the shadows chasing her. In the distance, she heard the echo of childish laughter, the same one she had heard in the cell. Finally, after what seemed like hours, she found a door. She flung it open, and upon crossing it, she found herself back in her house. Everything was as before, the party decorations intact, the balloons and streamers hanging from the ceiling. But something was different. Everything was silent. Vanessa ran to her mother, who was standing in the living room as if waiting for her. The girl, exhausted and trembling, threw herself into her arms. "Mom," she cried through tears. "I escaped. I'm here." But her mother didn't hug her. Instead, she looked at her with a vacant expression, as if she didn't recognize her. "Have we met before?" she asked with a coldness that froze Vanessa's blood. The girl took a step back, confused and terrified. And then she saw it. Behind her mother, hidden among the shadows, was the other girl. The same one she had seen in that dark place, the girl identical to her. And now, that girl had an even wider smile, a smile that seemed impossible on a human face. Vanessa then understood that she had never really escaped. Her place had been taken by the shadow that had been stalking her from the beginning. And the last thing she heard before the darkness enveloped her again was the sinister laughter of her double, who now lived in her place.